Hello and welcome. My name is Tom Ashton and I'm back for more bloody violent history with James Jackson. Together we're going to talk about moments from the past that tell us who we are, how we got here and perhaps where we're heading. And yes, it's often violent and generally quite bloody. Today we're going to discuss secret police. Some of the names and acronyms are familiar to you. KGB, Gestapo, Stasi, others perhaps less so. Democratic countries have secret security services which, with mixed results, protect the citizens of a country. Secret police might nominally be charged and promoted as the servant of their people, but this is not what they do in actuality. What they do is maintain and keep in place the dictatorial regime ruling a country. They are an instrument of oppression and control, a praetorian guard answerable to the man at the top, the party machine, the dictator. They are a symbol of oppression and control. They maintain the personality cult of the great leader, and this is all achieved with the help of informants, arrest, interrogation, torture, and summary execution. So, Jamie, here we are in room 101, and we're going to start with the Spanish Inquisition.
The tribunal of the Holy Office was extremely important, both for the Spanish and for the papacy. It was there to root out dissidents and to enforce an orthodoxy. And that really is what we're talking about. Although people wouldn't see it as a secret police force today, it had many of the sort of state-backed instruments to ensure that the orthodoxy was not challenged. So when it was set up in the late 15th century, it allowed torture, for example. It regulated torture, but torture nevertheless. It had auto da fe, it had burnings at the stake, it had denunciations, and the Edict of Faith allowed people to denounce others. And there was no defence. You could be sent to jail for 2 years before your trial even came about.
Why was it Spain rather than Rome and the Vatican that was doing this?
Because this came about under King Ferdinand II and Ferdinand and Isabella, and they felt they were fighting a holy war. First of all, they wanted to enforce the papal form of Christianity. They didn't want a sort of reformation in Spain. Secondly, they then turned on the Jews. And thirdly, in Spain, there was a clampdown on Islam. Ferdinand and Isabella got rid of a lot of Muslims from their country. I mean, we mentioned this in our Pirates podcast, the fact that so many Muslims were expelled. But there were confessions, and one of the jobs of the Inquisition was to ensure that people were actually not only confessing, but converting to Christianity. And it wasn't just a ruse. It wasn't just surface deep.
So it's a genuine conversion. So they would check up on them and things like that.
Oh, they would certainly check up on them. And you could be severely punished if you didn't. Again, it's just like the Nazis, or it's just like what happened in the Soviet Union. It's this idea that you could not deviate from the rules. You had to abide by a strict code. And everything was given a sort of fraudulent legitimacy, if you like. Even the torture, you were examined by a physician beforehand. There was a certain number of tortures that could be committed against the individual. It was very regulated.
So it was all sort of correctly done according to their set of rules, even though their rules were completely twisted and insane.
It was by the book. And by the time you get to the blood councils in the Low Countries, you had tens of thousands being burnt at the stake by the Papal Inquisition. This was under Charles VI. So, there was a great deal of torture, many, many burnings going on.
And when you say the Low Countries, essentially you mean Holland or the Netherlands?
Yes, what we call the Netherlands today. And this is one of the reasons that Elizabeth I and Walsingham, when they were basically trying to find allies to fight Spain and King Philip II of Spain and ward off invasion plans of Spain, why they put out feelers to the resistance in the Low Countries, because what was happening was a huge resistance movement, and the Spanish were pretty barbaric towards that resistance.
And the resistance was partly the Protestant movement, was it?
Completely.
Right.
And this is what the fight was about. And they were a very effective resistance. It was their flyboats, it was their shallow draft boats that did so much to hamper the invasion craft of the Duke of Parma during the Spanish Armada of 1588.
And their inquisitors, their secret police, what kind of tortures were they administering to convert people and so on?
Oh, they did a lot of gauntlets and spikes and all brandings, all the things that you would expect of secret police and torturing. And this went on for decades to come. There were manuals on how to apply tortures. And just as we see in the 20th century, you had travelling inquisitors, travelling interrogators. Torquemada, the great papal inquisitor, he started as a sort of regional chief and then ended up as the chief of the official Spanish Inquisition.
So you knew when he turned up in town that you were in for a bad time?
You definitely knew you were in for a bad time. And it started with this idea that during Mass in church, you had 30 days from then to look at your soul and then make a confession. They then dropped the 30 days and you were put on the spot at that point, and torture could be unleashed at any moment.
And I imagine one of the techniques was that they were putting people in every village against each other.
Oh, they were. I mean, denunciation was the key, just as we'll see later on with the French Revolution, for example. J'accuse becomes a very useful tool of secret police. It is incredible how many informants there are, whether it's the Stasi in East Germany or whether it was the Gestapo during the Second World War.
Yeah, or even the people in Cuba under the Castro regime. Every other person was kind of having to say something about their neighbour.
Well, this is how it works. It becomes sort of self-fulfilling.
Yeah, this kind of thing goes back to ancient times. I mean, whether it's the Chinese and the Ming dynasty murdering 15,000 people on one occasion, or, you can go back to ancient Rome and the Praetorian Guard, who initially were there to guard the emperor and eventually became the people who could decide who the emperor was. But we want to move forward in time and talk about the French Revolution. So most of us have heard a little bit about the Terror, which was what started in 1793 in Paris. Jamie, what happened there?
Terror just about sums it up, because you have this factionalism among the revolutionaries and the extreme, the Jacobins, really led by Robespierre.
So, sorry, the revolution had happened a couple of years before, had kicked off.
Yes, and the king had been executed, and the Jacobins on the Revolutionary Council had really taken over, and they started introducing laws. They ended up suspending the Constitution. They introduced the law of suspects and then the law of 22 prairials. And this was the idea that you could be denounced, you could be dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and you had no right to defence. So you ended up in Paris with 2,600 people being guillotined, being dragged to the guillotine. Across France as a whole, you ended up with up to 17,000 people being sentenced to death and guillotined. And there was no let-up. I mean, you could be accused from the age of 14 to 92. That's the age range of those who went to the guillotine.
Who was running all of this?
It was the Revolutionary Council, and Robespierre headed it up. But he had essentially his governors, his police, his secret police, going throughout the provinces. There were 82 representatives who went to the provinces and tortured with impunity and guillotined people with impunity around France. So by the end of the terror, you actually ended up with probably about 40,000 people being murdered by the revolutionaries. And it ranged from aristocrats to peasants to
bourgeoisie,
to the bourgeoisie, to nuns, to clerics, bishops. I mean, no one was safe because denunciation was the key. And that's really what we're talking about in terms of secret police. They are part of the instrument of terror. They are part of the overall construct that a totalitarian state creates around it. And if you go to the conciergerie today and see the ladder up and down which Robespierre went to his bedroom in between interrogating people and taking denunciations, it really puts a chill up your spine. It's pretty terrifying. But like all revolutions, like all police states, they end up devouring their own. And it's interesting that, first of all, Robespierre essentially destroyed all the factions who were fighting each other. He had the leaders guillotined, and then he was overthrown himself because the terror got out of hand and people were so fearful. A bit like the doctors and courtiers who stood back while Stalin was dying. No one wanted to get close. No one wanted to save someone or put their neck on the line for someone who could easily turn around and kill them. So that is one of the problems with these police states, these secret police states. And you see the number of KGB men, the KGB bosses, who have been devoured by their systems over the years. Certainly under Stalin. It's not a safe position. However psychopathic and brutal you are, it catches up with you in the end. And this is exactly what happened during the French Revolution. And
when did all this happen, Jamie?
It essentially happened between September 1793 and July 1794. So that spasm of violence, that spasm of extreme cruelty and brutality was during that sort of limited period. And you can see from the number of people being guillotined in Paris. I mean, on Christmas Day, 1793, you had 247 people being taken on tumbrils to the guillotine. So a lot of heads were rolling. And all these symbols of that oppression, of that state, whether it's the guillotine or the tricoteurs, the old women who used to knit watching the heads roll. I mean, each sort of revolution, each revolutionary state has these symbols that stand out. Just as in 1871, it was the pétroleurs, the women who went around burning houses.
And the sans-culottes.
Yes. I mean, these are the sorts of things that grow up out of these terrible situations.
And you mentioned Christmas Day. Was that done because they were essentially an atheistic organisation, so they wanted to make a point?
They were certainly making an anti-clerical comment on that particular time. And they wanted to expunge Catholicism, which they saw associated with royalty, from the French way of life. And that sort of secularism survives in France to this day.
So a particularly unpleasant individual, one of these representatives, was the executioner of Lyon, Joseph Fouché.
And it sort of foreshadows Klaus Barbie and the Gestapo in the 1940s, who was known, of course, as the Butcher of Lyon. So Fouché was a classic example. And again, it shows what secret policemen really are. They're on one hand, they're butchers and psychopaths. On the other hand, they're bureaucrats. And it doesn't really matter who they serve, as long as they're in command, as long as they're not the ones being tortured or guillotined. They are perfectly happy. And if you take someone like Fouché, he ended up crossing sides, turning against Robespierre, setting him up for his downfall, and became chief of police for Napoleon in the end. But if you look at his record, my God, he was psychopathic. I mean, he specialized in tying prisoners together and firing grape shot at them until they were mutilated and maimed, and then they were finished off with blades. and he killed hundreds in that fashion. In fact, he ended up being recalled to Paris and told to calm things down a bit because he was so cruel. But
what was he trying
resurrected
to
himself.
establish by doing this? Was he just trying to make everybody basically kowtow to the revolution? Or
Completely. And it's to do with enforcing terror. It's to do with enforcing fear. And we see that with the Cheka in revolutionary Russia later on, with Felix Dzerzhinsky, where he said that his organization was the personification of terror. And that is essentially what the secret police are. They are the sharp end of enforcement and oppression. And there's no right of appeal, there's no right to a defense, and you can just disappear. And you see that in secret police states from Chile, Argentina, all the way back to revolutionary France.
so what they've learnt, at least since 1871, was that these organisations have to be extremely barbaric and cruel to be able to push through their whatever they're going to do with their regime.
Well, that's the one thing Lenin learned from the Commune in 1871 in Paris. He said the reason it failed, it wasn't tough enough, it wasn't cruel enough, it didn't exterminate its enemies fast enough. And so if there's one lesson that secret police know, it's that you don't leave witnesses, you don't lead people alive, and you don't leave evidence that can be brought against them later on.
No mercy.
No mercy. But you always keep your options open, just as Himmler did towards the end of the war, trying to negotiate with the Allies. They're always keeping the door open to see if they can switch sides, as so many former Gestapo members did, switching to the Stasi or working for the Gehlen organization, Reinhard Gehlen's organization, and the CIA post-World War II, fighting the Soviets.
It makes a mockery of people calling these organisations left-wing or right-wing. They're not either wing, are they? They're a complete sort of thing on their own.
Well, they're part of the same spectrum. In a way, it's a circle. You join together in the end.
In the pits. Now to Russia and the Russian Revolution of 1917. Lenin in 1917 appoints Felix Dzerzhinsky as the head of the secret police. And Dzerzhinsky's view on how to manage the situation, he stated as follows: "We represent in ourselves organised terror." That was his rule of thumb.
He wasn't kidding either. I mean, the Red Terror that lasted from 1918 to 1922 immediately killed about 100,000 people. It was this enforcement. It was that lesson that we talked about that Lenin had learned from the Paris Commune of 1871, which collapsed because they weren't cruel enough. It wasn't a tough enough tyranny. And you can see what happened. I mean, if you take March 1919, when the Cheka forces went in to the Putilov factory, which was striking, and just immediately summarily executed 200 of the strike ringleaders. And that's the sort of thing that happens. And that's really the beginning of a police state.
Oh, and also 200 ringleaders. There were only 900 in the factory. So, I mean, it was... it wasn't like one or two ringleaders. It was basically a fifth of everybody in there.
Indeed. And every time that the OGPU, the secret police, or the Cheka, or whatever you call the secret police of that period, every time they executed people during the week, those results, those execution figures would be published in the national press. And it was the idea that you had to terrify people. You had to absolutely crush them into the dirt to ensure that they were subservient, that they were subjugated, and that they would pay homage to the man in charge and to the party and the state. And there was no deviation from that. And that's the moment where the secret police become the key to enforcing that orthodoxy. that we mentioned with the French Revolution and with the Spanish Inquisition. It is almost a religion.
And they go from being the tip of the spear, as you say, of the great leader or whatever, to becoming the people who are in charge of the whole show and appointing their own person at the top. Is that not the ultimate aim?
Well, that is the evolution. You saw the KGB take over with Andropov. You saw the state machine moving in, the secret police machine moving in. And if you look at Russia today, you actually have more informants per member of the population. You have more members of the FSB, internal security, per head of the population than you did during the KGB era. And you get a KGB man in charge running Russia. The KGB or the whatever you call the intelligence apparatus today.
Or the FSB.
Yes, yes. But the intelligence machine actually not only owns Russia's oil, it is in charge of Russia's nuclear warheads. It in a way, is no longer run by the state. It runs the state. So it's turned the whole secret police thing on its head. This is where the secret police becomes the secret state.
Yeah, because I would have thought some people would think that in the Soviet Union days there would be more KGB agents, but apparently it's for every 428 citizens there was one KGB agent, whereas today there is one agent for every 297 citizens, one FSB agent. So the numbers have doubled.
And we've been talking about secret police being an instrument of tyranny and terror and orthodoxy, imposing an orthodoxy. It is one strut of basically expunging democracy from the system. And it goes hand in hand with getting rid of a free press or investigative journalists, of seeing dissidents either killed or put in jail or forced into exile. These are the sorts of things. You might not have the gulag system, but there are other ways of control, and the secret police are still very much in charge.
And it seems like the numbers grow exponentially and become less and less important. I mean, in that you mentioned 100,000 killed in the time of Lenin, but by the time they got round to the purges, we're talking about 1 million, and then the Ukraine in 1928.
Yes, they were all part of the system of dekulakization, industrialization, collectivization, and anyone who stood in the path of that was simply destroyed. I mean, the terror from 36 to 38, as you said, killed 1 million. The starvation, the ordered starvation that Stalin imposed on the Ukraine, killed up to 4 million people. And
30% of the population.
Yes, and across Russia as a whole, Stalin's believed to have killed up to 30 million people. So, whether it's the gulag or starvation or any of these other things, or just going through a list saying kill 10,000 people, that's what the secret police were there to do on cue. And it's quite interesting that Oleg Gordievsky, who defected to Britain, his father was KGB and had taken part in all sorts of massacres and never mentioned it. I don't think was particularly troubled by it. That was just part of the system. And you did it out of loyalty, and you did it because you didn't want to be next on the list.
So for the Russians, Jamie, what is your overall impression of how the secret police have operated there over the last century?
Well, what stands out, we've talked about the oppression of the French Revolution. For me, what so vividly stands out about the Soviet oppression, there are two things. First of all is that statue, that famous 15-ton statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky that was toppled in Dzerzhinsky Square in front of the Lubyanka and the KGB headquarters, the one to which I gave the finger when I was a teenager. That's a statue that I'll always remember. And the other thing I remember were the stories of how people in their apartments used to see smoke coming through the walls because the secret police were sitting behind the walls just watching them and smoking cigarettes. So that's what stands out. There are always these different things that come to mind, these different images that really symbolize oppression and the secret police state. And that, for me, is what does it.
Did Dzerzhinsky survive?
He did survive.
He retired and died in his own bed.
Yes, he wasn't killed like the later members of the KGB, the later chiefs of the KGB, who were all killed by their underlings, essentially, who then took over and in turn were killed.
So now we come to our old friends, the Nazis. But really this section is about the Nazis and how people in the Gestapo became officers and agents for the Stasi after the end of the Second World War. But in the war, certainly the Gestapo developed some extremely cruel and unpleasant methods for getting information out of their prisoners. As an example, beating their prisoners with, there was one officer who used to beat them with a rhino whip, and he could beat his prisoners to death, much like in the time of the Tsar, the punishment for the serfs, if they were infringing something, would be to be beaten with the knout, which is a heavy sort of whip with hooks and bits of metal in it, which the particularly vicious form of that, they could actually break the back of the person being whipped and then they would die.
Well, that Gestapo man actually had a reputation of being able to remove heads with his rhino whip. So it just became the norm. And like so many of these secret police units around the world, they just attract all the lowlife, all the psychopaths who are looking for an outlet and looking for a rung on the ladder that will get them into official positions. Human nature does not change, as we've seen time and time again through this podcast series. And the secret police always attract a certain type, and viciousness and violence becomes the norm. I always remember the story of the young SAS officer who was captured, and of course Hitler had his commando order and wanted them all tortured and killed, and that none of them should go to prisoner of war camps and be allowed to survive. And there was one SAS officer, they tortured and beat him every day, and every day he would just shout, "Fuck the Germans," every time they entered his cell. And he did that every day until the last day when he was murdered. And it really epitomizes the secret police state, that this became the norm, whether it was beating people to death or guillotining them or throwing them alive into furnaces. And that's before you even get to the concentration camps and death camps. This is before you even get to the Holocaust. This is about oppressing your own kind, oppressing your own people and those that you have taken over.
So there are always people willing to collaborate with these people.
Completely. I mean, look at the Quisling regime in Norway, for example. But if ever you want a good example, you can see how the French behaved during the Second World War. And it's fairly telling that when the Gestapo advertised in Paris for an auxiliary Gestapo among the French, they wanted 2,000. 6,000 applicants came forward. So that was the Karlinger group, and they had a reputation for appalling viciousness during the war. We mentioned this in our Secret Sites podcast, but you look at the number of hotels in what was then Vichy France that had rooms given over to torture. They had bedsteads with no mattresses on which people could be tied and tortured. And this was going on all the time. And the Karlinger group, the auxiliary Gestapo, were also known as the Bonnet-Le-Font group or gang. And that was set up by a former French policeman and a former petty criminal. And they went to work. They executed scores of people.
And then we come on to the end of the war and the re-employment of some of these appalling people in the Stasi, which is the East German secret police.
It's very easy to move across. If there's a regime you're not going to worry whether it's communist or whether it's Nazi. They need your services, so you provide them. And what's fascinating about the Stasi is, yes, they were brutal. The regime was absolutely terrible. But they took the concept of informants to a completely new level. It was every block of flats had an informant in it. I mean, everyone was watching everyone else.
And they sort of refined the worst bits of the way the Russians behaved in their secret police and the Gestapo. So they brought a sort of German efficiency to the barbaric practices of the KGB.
Oh yes, they had a concept called Zersetzung, which was deconstruction. They would basically drive you mad. They would move furniture around. They would fake affairs that you might have had so that you would break up with your wife or husband. They would change the clocks in your flat. They would bug you. They would make sure that you lost your job. I mean, they really played with people's minds. And it was Orwellian. And there are still thousands of people today who are on disability benefit because they were so mentally disturbed by what was going on. And you can see the level of cruelty. I mean, I've heard a clip of a secret court in East Germany that was sentencing a woman to death, and she was screaming and crying. And this judge was ranting at her, and it was so like Roland Freisler, the Nazi judge, the mad judge who had condemned all the anti-Nazi plotters and members of the White Rose. Nothing had changed.
But, and he had the curtain behind his chair, did he? On the guillotine.
Well, that was in Prague. I mean, that was terrible. It was the people who were hunting the killers of the Great Escape, POWs. They went to Prague and they found a courtroom, and there was a curtain behind. And
behind the judge's chair.
Behind the judge's chair. And they drew back the curtain, and there was a rail with meat hooks on. So they were taking people from summary court convictions, taking them behind.
And just hooking
them up, and then pushing them along the wire to the coffins in the next door room. And there was a guillotine there. So, those sort of people, those people who could inflict that sort of barbarism, were very quickly immersed in the Stasi, were embraced into the Stasi. But what is fascinating is that the Stasi were an information gathering organization as secret police. They never really got rid of information. So when the wall came down and when East Germany collapsed, they didn't have any decent paper shredders. They couldn't shred all the evidence. So today, the German government have got software that can put together all the partly burnt papers and all the partially shredded papers and put all the pieces of information back together again.
And discover who was doing what to
who was informing.
But except it turned out that they were all informing. I mean, not all, but I mean, there's not going to be very many innocent people.
No, not in that regime. And if you think it's going to be the equivalent of a 1,000-year Reich, you tend to buy into the system that's there. And they always estimate there were probably up to or more than 500,000 informants to the Stasi. And that is what a secret police state does.
Yeah.
It's
what
terrifying.
was the population? 20 million, something like that? Could be. Yeah, I reckon it was about that. All right, let's leave the Stasi and head across the Atlantic to South America and some terrible goings-on in Chile and Argentina. So Chile first. Pinochet was a dictator, the dictator in Chile from 1973 to 1990. What happened there, Jamie?
Well, there's so many of those Nazis, so many of those people post-Second World War simply emigrated to South America and found their home among these regimes, whether it was in Bolivia or Chile or Argentina or Paraguay. And their services were needed. If you look at the torture and the oppression and the secret police of these dictators out there, so many of them learnt lessons from the Nazis from the people who were migrating to help their cause. And, there were a flock of travelling executioners and travelling interrogators and torturers, such as Klaus Barbie and his fiancés of death, as they were called in Bolivia. So Chile was no exception to those who gave a welcome, not only to ex-Nazis, but also to those sort of techniques. And tens of thousands were tortured in Chile. You had people brought aboard a naval training ship, for example, Esmeralda, that ended up in the tall ships race. She was used as a floating base in which to torture and interrogate and abuse prisoners. And many people were killed on board her.
Yeah, they were beaten, sexually assaulted, electrocuted and tortured with water boarding, as well as being murdered and tossed overboard.
And that's on top of the 20,000 who were incarcerated in the National Stadium in Chile. And that became, if you've ever seen the film Missing, that became a notorious centre for torture and incarceration, and people were being electrocuted, as you say, burnt with cigarette butts, had their heads smashed against concrete walls. And again, this is classic secret police tactics. It's not just detaining people off the streets or raiding their homes. It's making a mass demonstration of the power of the state, and the secret police are the enforcers of that.
And on the other side of the Andes, you've got Argentina and the ESMA.
Well, that was notorious, the Naval Mechanical School. It was a torture centre, and of the 5,000 people who were held captive there, 90% of those died in captivity, including nuns.
Died or disappeared.
Disappeared. Yeah. It was the most terrible thing, and it's known that many of the people who were killed were drugged and dropped to the sharks in the ocean, were taken by helicopter and dropped in the ocean alive to drown or to be fed to the sharks. It was really horrific what was going on out in Argentina under the junta.
And there was one particularly unpleasant individual who did meet his just deserts eventually, Alfredo Assis.
Yes, Alfredo Assis was a lieutenant commander, and he was known as the Angel of Death. So you can see how his reputation
the blonde
preceded
Angel
him.
of Death.
Yes, and the Weiße Engel. And he was actually captured on South Georgia.
That's a movie reference.
Indeed. But he was captured on South Georgia by British forces during the Falklands War and was sent back to Argentina. But justice did catch up with him because he was given life imprisonment eventually when the junta fell. But these are the sort of lunatics that end up being drawn to work for a totalitarian regime. These are the enforcers.
Okay, back across the Atlantic again to Africa, where we've got some flamboyant, although deeply unpleasant, secret police operating. For example, in Uganda, when Idi Amin was in charge.
Oh, the Bureau of State Research. The extraordinary thing about so many of the African and the sort of Caribbean despots is that their secret police weren't that secret, because the emphasis was on public oppression, of making a statement and doing that old Felix Dzerzhinsky thing of being the instruments of terror and fear. And so the Bureau of State Research, they used to go around in sort of co-under suits, in floral shirts and bell-bottom trousers, and the obligatory shades that they wore. But again, don't be fooled by how they looked, how ridiculous they looked. They used to spirit people away to the prison on Nakasero Hill outside Kampala, and they'd never be seen again. So it was really an instrument of oppression and brutality. What's so extraordinary is that they were trained by so many different people. Like on one stage, they were trained by the Israelis. As we know, Amin fell out with Israel big time. You look at the Entebbe raid and you can see why. And then they were trained by the KGB, so the Russians were getting their claws in as well, trying to gain influence, because we've talked about this in other podcasts, that training bodyguards or training the paramilitaries and special forces is a great way of gaining influence on a country's affairs.
And it's interesting, this sort of symbiotic relationship between the dictators and their secret police. One of the things I came across was this idea of coup proofing for dictators, which I thought was quite good. Essentially, the dictator is in danger of being superseded by someone else, quite possibly the head of the Secret Service. And the way to avoid that, I think Hitler was pretty good at this. There are two things you have to do. The first is division of power, and I think Hitler was well known for divvying up different things to different people: Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, and all of that coterie of baddies that ran underneath him. And then the second thing is you purge in favor of your family or tribe. So you basically put people in charge, dotted around, and they're all really loyal to you, not just through some sort of friendship, but through blood ties.
Well, this is why you don't get democracy flourishing in so many of these countries, because not only does it suit the secret police chief or your family members or tribal members to stay in power so that you can be favoured, but also, and avoid being killed, but also because it's your only means to the access of wealth in the country. And that's the problem with actually having any sort of democracy. You go over to Haiti, of course, and the symbol of oppression there, and probably one of the worst secret police states in the world, under both Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier, was their volunteers of national security. You can do the French for me, Tom.
God, I'm so looking forward to you being volunteer security nationale.
There you go. Become its chief. But they were totally barbaric. And again, in a fairly low population, you're talking about 30,000 people just being vanished from the face of the earth. And again, they were pretty visible, and they were linked to voodoo, and they were part of that whole oppressive image. And rather than the floral shirts of Idi Amin, Papa Doc and Baby Doc's VSN used to go around in sort of denim and straw hats, and the wrap-round shades. That was part of the course. But they used to burn people alive, mutilate them, torture them, and hang the corpses in trees as part of a sort of overall voodoo ritual. And in fact, their chief went one further. He used to force people to give blood, which he then sold to medical institutions in America and elsewhere around the world. He was known as the vampire of the Caribbean. So it was pretty grim.
Oh, and so as to not leave out Southeast Asia in this pantheon of baddies, the Khmer Rouge. What about them, Jamie?
Yes, their secret police was set up quite early, even before they got into power, the Santabelle, and they ran all the 150 execution sites. And we've gone through before in podcasts about the horrors of Cambodia. But again, this is the totality of the secret state, the killing state, and the secret police, the organs of oppression. You can trace them all the way back through all the other secret police organizations to these totalitarian states. And I think that through all the secret police forces that we've mentioned, there runs this theme that if you're answerable just to the state and not to the people, if you don't have the balancing aspects of power, the sort of equality before the law, a free press, you are never going to get a properly democratic regime. You are always going to run the risk of oppression.
Do you think it's a waste of time for democracies to try and, show people how to run a democratic country in these places where they just never really seem to be interested in it. I mean,
I think we've tried in many cases over the years. And failed. And whether it's through aid or whether it's through invasion, you end up with the same result, that countries will revert to type. The countries will end up with the sort of regimes that suit their culture. So you can't really impose a homogeneity or democracy from the outside. You can show them how it is. You can show them the advantages of it, but ultimately it's up to those people. And if those people aren't going to fight for freedom, if they're not going to stand up and say, this is how we want to be governed, then you're always going to end up with either a clan-based, tribal-based, or secret police-based society.
Yeah, depressing. There we go. Well, Jamie, that just about brings it to a close. One more thing, our postscript. We're going to talk about the Chinese.
Well, China is a good place to end because in a way it's the natural evolution of the secret police state. It's where things can get to with the technology. We spoke of what happened in East Germany and the refinement of oppressive tools and techniques. But when you get the technology of today added to the mix, then you're in a dangerous situation. And if you look at China and its Skynet system, the last time that anyone bothered to count, there were 200 million plus cameras in China. And those cameras are going to be linked to artificial intelligence, to facial recognition, to social credit. So there is going to be a vast data bank on every individual. And that is a system of control. And that control is in the hands of the secret police and the state and the party, which are a whole. And so it'll be interesting to watch, but it's certainly not a system that any of us want to be part of in free, liberal Western democracies. It's something that's pretty terrifying and that we have to keep a watch on because it's too easy. It can happen here. And with artificial intelligence and modern technology, the banning of VPNs in China, you've got a pretty desperate situation and one that can only get worse. And given that the Chinese themselves, the citizens, have to use sort of code words and euphemisms to get round the sort of recognition features, the word recognition on social media, then you've got a problem. Then you've got a system that is very oppressive. The fact that social media is crashed the whole time by the Chinese state whenever they think things are getting out of control or gossip is becoming too rampant. So it's one to watch. And that is where the secret police state can end.
Skynet. I wonder what the Chinese is for I'll be back.
Look it up.
Right, that's quite enough of these grim characters and events. Not a grain of humour amongst their psychotic ranks. I think we should dust off our dinner jackets and head off to the secret policeman's ball. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, Tom.
So it goes. Thanks for listening. My name is Tom Ashton and his name is James Jackson. Please subscribe on BVH on your podcast. It really helps others to hear about us if you leave us lots of stars and a review. You can find us on our website at bloodyviolenthistory.com. For suggestions and comments, you can email me at talk@bloodyviolenthistory.com. Thank you and good luck.